Hi, everybody. This is my secret project. I got John Sherman. Uh, he led a long, distinguished career. He was congressman, then a senator. He served as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of the State. The early years, he was born in Lancaster, Ohio on May 10th, 1823. His father, Charles Sherman, was appointed to the Supreme Court of Ohio. He died suddenly in 1829. John was just 6 years old. John and his brother Hoyt stayed with their mother, Mary Hoyt Sherman, in Lancaster until 1831. Then he moved with his uncle, also named John Sherman, and started school at the age of 8. To me, that seems kind of late, but it's never too late to start. Uh, he was known that he had put a dead sheep on his teacher's desk. He got caught. He left a note. They matched his handwriting, and then they almost expelled him. There was also an account of him punching another teacher. Apparently, the teacher had slapped him on the right hand, and he punched him with the left. So he seems to be a little ambidextrous. He left school in 1837 and became a surveyor. He got this job through one of the political parties at the time, the Whigs. Apparently, just like today, you can get jobs through political favors. And also, just like today, he lost his job 1839 due to a new Democratic governor. He comes in and he says, "I don't like your party. I got a friend who I want to do this job, so I'm going to appoint him." And he lost his job. So the following year, he decided to enter law school. He was following one of his other brothers. He got accepted by the Ohio Bar in 1844, and he joined his brother's law firm, Charles Taylor Sherman. Um, he entered politics in 1844, supported by, again, the Whig Party. He was elected to Ohio's 13th congressional district in 1854 as a member of the opposition party. Now, I had to do the research on this, but apparently all politics was local back then. You would get these parties and they would be coalitions of other parties, and it just happened to be like your neighbor and your other neighbor, and they were part of this party, you were part of that party, but you all banded together, and maybe you form a new party like the opposition party. He was appointed to the 34th United States Congress. That was his first term. His primary reason for entering politics was the slavery question, and at the time, it was there was newly acquired territory from the Mexican-American War, and one of these places was Kansas, the Kansas Territory. And the question was, should it be free or pro-slave? He was definitely came down on the free side. He also gave one of his first speeches on finances. Like today, you're going to hit on the hot button issues of the time, and just like it is now and how it's probably going to be forever is going to be the financial situation of the country. And about this time, before he was reelected to a second term, the opposition party and the Whig, all these different parties kind of solidified into what then was called the Republican Party. They're not the Republicans of today, which again, this is one of those weird things in history where the parties change names. The Republicans then are mostly the Democrats of today, if that sounds strange. But he was reelected in 1856 to his second term, and then in his third term, in 1858, he was assigned to serve as chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means. Now, this committee is considered to be like the most powerful committee in the House. You control the finance, like the way the money's spent, the way it's collected. I mean, you collect the money and you control how the money's spent. You control everything. Again, it's the most powerful committee in the House. He had powerful friends. They helped him get elected. They helped him get on this committee. He was elected for a fourth term to Congress in 1860. He was an avid Abraham Lincoln supporter. He gave speeches on his behalf. He campaigned for him. Again, he was against slavery. This Abraham Lincoln was against slavery, so he was with Abraham Lincoln. 1860. John Sherman started his Senate career very differently than he started his congressional career or as a representative. Uh, Abraham Lincoln took office in 1861 and nominated one of the then senators from Ohio to be the Secretary of the Treasury. Well, this left a vacancy, so like today, the state legislature would then appoint someone or nominate someone to be that new senator to fill that seat after the election. But again, I did the research on this, and at the time, we didn't directly vote for our senator. The state legislature always appointed the senators. It was kind of like you could petition them, the state legislature, to who you liked. You could say, hey, I like this guy, and they would appoint him, or maybe not. Maybe they appoint the person that they want. You know, again, he had powerful friends, so maybe again this is how they're helping him out. He started in his Senate career on March 23rd, 1861, in the 37th Congress. Next, you have the American Civil War. You know, John Sherman briefly served as an unpaid colonel in the Ohio Volunteers. He never fought in the war, but this was kind of like his way to help bolster or recruitment. He was doing his part to help the war. His older brother William Tecumseh Sherman, who's in the picture here, was a famous Civil War general. He's famous for the Sherman's March, where they marched all the way to the Atlantic Ocean and burned everything along the way. Try to make war as bad as possible, so the South would just lose their will to fight. John Sherman was assigned to the Senate Finance Committee. At first he wasn't the chair, but later he becomes the chair of the Finance Committee. But Lincoln needed to pay for this war. Sherman was his friend, helped campaign for him, so he's putting key people in key places. Again, powerful friends. While he was there, he helped pass the Revenue Act of 1861. This was a monumental law that was passed. It imposed the first federal income tax in American history. Before this, the states collected their money, and it was their money. And it was kind of a suggestion to send some of this money to the federal government. But after the passage of the Revenue Act, the federal government directly collected from the states. He was also instrumental in helping to install the national banking system. Laid the groundwork for it. Back then they didn't have a Federal Reserve or a national banking system. The states had their own banks, but this made more of a national bank. That's a whole nother topic. You could have a whole lesson just on that. You could go in extreme depth just on that and how it affects us today. Post-war, you had to have answer the slavery question, of course, and had to reconstruct the South. So in 1964, which is pretty much around the end of the war, if you ever seen that movie Lincoln, he helped vote for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And then again, he voted for the 14th Amendment, which gave equal protection under the laws. And the target here again was slaves. They didn't want the free slaves to not have these protections. The 15th Amendment was passed, which he helped, guaranteed the right to vote for anybody. You couldn't restrict it because of race. He then voted for several key pieces of legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was kind of neutered in the House, but it laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Movement later. And the Reconstruction Act, which again, you have to rebuild the destroyed South after the Civil War. So he was instrumental in that. He was reelected to the Senate again for a second term in 1866, still on the Senate Finance Committee. There again, his powerful friends keeping him in power. Once you're there, apparently it's hard to get rid of you. He's, right at the crux of power in the Senate. Uh, then you have the golden years, which I like to call the golden years. He was reelected to the Senate in 1872. Uh, he's like 49 at this point. Uh, he only served 5 years of that term. Uh, he was appointed by President Hayes to be Secretary of the Treasury. The guy's got a long list of financial committees that he's on. He's a logical choice. From a resume standpoint, um, in 1880, Hayes said he only wanted to be a one-term president, and he really wanted John Sherman to be his successor, but he never formally went out and endorsed him. It's like Obama going out and endorsing Biden to be his successor, like campaigning for him stuff. Hayes never did that for him. He never really had the backing that he needed. Uh, he lost. He lost. He didn't make the nomination. Uh, but then he was reelected by the state legislature in Ohio to go back to the Senate, and again he rejoined the state or the Senate Finance Committee, but someone else had already been appointed as the chair. He didn't go back in as the chair, but he's still right there with the money. 1884, he tried a second time to run for president, and again he couldn't gain any traction. I'm thinking like a Ron Paul figure, from what I had seen in the research. He's kind of like a perennial candidate at this point, but not quite getting there, harping on finances and you know things to do with slavery in the South. Uh, he's reelected to the Senate in 1886, and his final term was in 1892. So at this point, he's pretty high up there in age. Uh, but towards the end of his last term in 1897, he was appointed by President Garfield. At the age of 74, he was appointed by President Garfield to be the Secretary of State. He dealt with certain questions like with Cuba and stuff like that. But again, that could be a whole nother lesson. Um, Retirement and his death. He retired from public life. He resigned as Secretary of State. That was his final act. He had spent 42 years, 4 months, and 22 days in government service. So, at the time, that was a long time. I mean, people's life expectancies weren't what they were today. This guy gave everything to the country. Is from my point of view, is what it looked like. He just kind of stuck it out and over 40 years of service. His wife had a stroke, and she died on June 5th, 1900. And then he died on October 22nd, 1900, 139 days later, at the age of 77. So, and, one of the things from one of the references I had, he kind of regretted not spending more time with his family. I guess that's, looking back, you spend all that time in office and, you're probably campaigning half the time and you're legislating the other half of the time. And, that's pretty much it. Thanks, guys.